Okay, so we are live now, but I won't start with the questions straight away to give people a chance to trickle in. But hi, everybody who is joining. It's great to see you all, and thank you for joining. So we did want to kick things off just by talking about who you would invite to a dinner party and why, a famous historical figure. Obviously, we're here today with the great Paterson Joseph, who's written a book about Charles Ignatius Sancho. So, Paterson, I'm assuming that would be your dinner party guest.
What do you think?
Wow, that's great.
He lives above my dining room table.
He basically is a dinner party guest already.
Every meal, when I'm not doing TV dinners in front of the sofa, he's there and haunting me and constantly prompting me to get some work done and stop watching football.
Oh, that's great.
How about you then? What would you? Who would you have?
Oh, I think I would pick Shakespeare.
Really?
Yeah, I would.
Some old bloke with a beard. Why?
Well, I was an English student in a past life, and I have written a lot about Shakespeare, so I'd love to speak to him.
Yeah, it'd be really interesting. What would be your first question?
Oh, well, I wrote a big essay all about the handkerchief in Othello, so I'd have to write, did the handkerchief really mean that much, or have we just made a massive deal about it for no reason?
Gosh, that's a really good question. I'm trying to think back to when the only time I played Othello, which was nearly 20 years ago now. I was about 39. I had wonderful Andy Serkis, who people might know from playing Gollum in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, but a great actor. But he played my Iago. I do remember the handkerchief discussion, but not in detail. That's a really good question. So you obviously got a first.
Maybe.
Nobody cares.
Yeah. No, that did help. That essay, but I think that was my favorite one that I wrote. But yeah, hi to everyone who's joining. It's great to see you all in the chat. As you're joining, if you could just introduce yourself and maybe where you're coming from. That's always nice to know where people are tuning in from. We've got an answer to our question. Oh, by the way, anyone who's joined while we've been speaking, we were talking about which historical figure we'd invite to a dinner party and why. And Victoria has commented she'd invite her great-great-grandfather, William Whitelock Lloyd, or her 7 times great-grandfather, Sir Bulstrode Whitelock. Wow. 7 times great-grandfather. I wonder how long ago that would have been. Maybe around the same time as Sancho.
Sancho, possibly, yeah. Right. That's a really interesting choice. And I wonder what question you would ask him.
Yeah.
Maybe we could have that as well. Be interesting.
Yeah, it would. Oh, so Victoria Alice is joining from Cardiff. Julie is from Lennoxtown. And Julie said, hi, Paterson.
Hi, Julie. Hi. This is so funny because I'm just saying hello to my screen. I presume you're out there. These are not fictional people, they're real people.
So Victoria's come back and said that her grandfather was 1605 to 1675, so a bit before Sancho.
Yeah.
But he knew Oliver Cromwell, so that's very interesting.
Yeah, my gosh.
Yeah, you could ask so much about that.
I wonder if he had a word with him and told him to stop messing about in Ireland.
Yeah.
He did terrible things. He did terrible things in Ireland, Oliver Cromwell.
Yeah.
This is the thing, though, about digging into the past, because you go, this, and I'm sure he is a good man. But then you can go back in the past and go, oh, this person that's my lovely ancestor. You go, oh, they were awful. Oh, they did terrible things. So it might be interesting to find out. Maybe you know Victoria. Maybe you know already his life story. That's interesting. It's what I did. I had this in '99. I checked out this book called Black England by Gretchen Gertziner, and I found all these characters in it from Roman Britain, black characters in it, black people, the courts of Henry VIII and VII, the court to Queen Elizabeth I, and I was just fascinated by everybody. And then I found him, and digging into his life, I initially was just like so excited as you see this wonderful portrait by Gainsborough. It's such a beautiful portrait, so unusual.
Yeah.
That Gainsborough painted that in Bath in 1768. Let's try and get it upright. It's hard with the computer. In 100 minutes. So it's a real drawing. But if you look at things like the sort of a bit shiny, that beautiful face. Look at that face. Ooh, trying to get over here. Look at that wonderful face. And the waistcoat. It's a sort of performance. So I always thought, oh, Sancho's an amazing character. But then you find out all sorts of things about them, and you think, oh, well, there are more things to him than simply, oh, he was a wonderful character. You know, he also had a grocery store in Westminster. But he was having a grocery store in the 1760s and 70s. And so, of course, he was selling slave goods, sugar, tobacco. So then you suddenly go, oh, I've got another picture of him now. I wonder what that felt like. It's interesting digging in the past.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll talk about this more in the Q&A, but I did find it so interesting with the book how you don't paint Sancho as this perfect man. He has flaws, and he has issues with his character. And that's I think that's always like a quite hard part about history to confront, that people you admire so much have all of these problems too. But I guess that's what makes them human.
That's what makes them fully human. That's right, Annabelle.
Okay, so I think numbers are settling down now, so we might get started with the Q&A if that's okay with you, Paterson.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. So first of all, I want to say a massive thank you to the Virtual Village Hall for hosting us today. We couldn't have done it without you. And thank you all as well for joining. I'm Annabelle Morgan from Listening Books. We are an audiobook lending charity here in the UK, for those of you who aren't familiar with us. And our service is for anyone who finds that their ability to read is affected by a disability, a mental health condition, an illness, or a learning difficulty. I think our details will be signposted throughout the Q&A by the Virtual Village Hall team. So if you think we could help, please do check us out. But that's not why we're here today. We are here to talk to Paterson Joseph all about his debut novel, The Secret Diaries of Charles Ignatius Sancho, which is actually one of our Members' Choice Award nominees this year.
Oh, really? Oh, that's nice.
Voting closes in a week, by the way. If anyone's watching and hasn't voted yet, you can head to our website and vote for Paterson.
I should have had a placard. Vote for me.
But thank you so much for being with us today.
No, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure, and I'm really grateful to be asked to come and field questions. It's a privilege.
Oh, lovely. Thank you. Well, I'm sure most people in the audience won't need an introduction, but I will give a quick one just in case. So Paterson Joseph is an acclaimed British actor on stage and screen. You might recognise him from TV programmes such as Vigil, Peep Show, Mallory Blackman's Noughts and Crosses, or even from the Shakespearean stage. But that's not why we're here today. We are here to talk about Paterson as a writer and a narrator, as we are an audiobook charity, with the debut of his novel, The Secret Diaries of Charles Ignatius Sancho. So thanks again, Paterson, for joining us. We are truly honoured to have you with us.
Thank you. What a lovely intro. I don't know who he is, but he sounds great.
No, don't sell yourself short. Right, so let's begin. If you have any questions for Paterson, please do pop them in the chat. But while those are coming in, Paterson, for those people who haven't read or listened to your book yet, could you just give a brief overview of The Secret Diaries of Charles Ignatius Sancho and the man behind the title?
Right. I have been studying Sancho's life since 1999. And when I picked up that book I mentioned earlier, Black England, which had just been republished by Gretchen Gertziner, there were several characters in there that I could have followed. As I said, there was Roman Britain characters, there were Elizabethan Tudor characters. But Sancho struck me initially because of his portrait. it was a visual, sort of arrest that happened to me. I just stopped and wondered, who is this? And how is this possible that this man, who is clearly a black man, is being dressed as a sort of aristocrat? And he also has, sorry to keep flicking up and down, but he also has his hand in his waistcoat, which those who know about the world of art and all of those things will know that is a sign of a man of leisure. But he worked for the royal family via the Duke of Montagu, who was his patron and his boss. He was valet to him at that point. And that was such a shock to me. I was already in my mid-30s, I think, when I discovered this. And I didn't know anything about any kind of Black England before the cliche of 1948 and the Windrush generation, my parents' generation. So that was what first struck me. And then I thought, I've got to do something. And I tried to give it away to someone to write, because I didn't think I was a writer. I wasn't very academically brilliant, and I was treated as if I wasn't from the very beginning. We could talk about that later. But I didn't think of myself as being capable of writing. And so I gave it to other people, and nothing rang a bell in terms of what I had in my head. And so I thought, I've just got to knuckle down. And after about 8 years of research, I finally stopped procrastinating and started writing. My son's 20 now, and he was about 18 months old when I first wrote the first bit of the monodrama, Sancho, An Act of Remembrance, which is where I started. And then, I've had years of performing it, mainly in America. People here in the UK, they liked the story and they thought it was unusual, but they kept saying, well, we're in a post-racist world, so these stories aren't really relevant to us today. It's just such a strange thing. And then, but that we're talking about the late 2000s and early 2010s. And then we had lockdown, unfortunately, in 2020. But halfway through sinking a submarine on Vigil, this BBC series I was doing, we stopped for a bit. And I thought, if I don't do it now, things are so busy in my day job that I probably will. I'll just be another 10 years trying to, write a novel. Because the great thing about doing a play is that it's very public. As I said, the portrait is a sort of performance, and his music, which I can talk about later, is also very public music. The letters that he wrote, reams of them, published, you can still get them today. But what about the intimacy of a novel, I thought? Because novels are so perfect. Like when I used to, play truant from school, and I did when I was about 13, and I discovered the art of doing the register, Joseph, yes, sir, and then walking out of school. And I would only go to Willesden Green Library, and I'd hide in the reference section, put my uniform in my satchel, and then read. But that idea of sinking into a novel and disappearing from Willesden Green, where I was brought up in northwest London, and going to Narnia, for example, or one of the wonderful Oscar Wilde stories. I remember reading The Picture of Dorian Gray and just being lost in this amazing world, and seeing that portrait in the attic completely. So I thought, I've got to write a novel. I've got to write a novel, because the novel is like a whisper in your ear, and it's perfect. All the imagery is perfect. There's no casting director who's told you, oh, this is who I'm casting. You go, oh, that's the wrong person. So I thought, I want that for this novel. And so I wrote it in diary form eventually in 2020. And the story of Sancho lends itself, I suppose, to this kind of sort of 18th century homage to Fielding, Tom Jones, and a little bit of Dickens as well. I think I've in a bit of future writing, just because the language of the 18th century is so tricky. But why Sancho is a good question, I suppose. He was born, according to his biographer, who's disputed, but it's the only biographer we have, on a slave ship in 1729. He was orphaned by the time he was 2. He was baptized in Colombia, Charles Ignatius. He was then shipped at 2 or 3 years old to Greenwich to live with 3 unmarried sisters who treated him as a pet. They wouldn't allow him to read. They wanted him to be like a lot of those kids. Even if you just look up black people in portraiture, you just see hundreds on hundreds of images of young children with trays, you know, all dressed up, either as mythical characters. But it's all about the white subject, and Sancho sort of, or Sancho-like figures are all sort of gazing up at these white masters and mistresses. And he would have been that silent child, you know, looking expensive and exotic, like their owners had taste and global influence. They didn't teach him how to read, and he ran away from home. He's found, luckily, in Blackheath Park by a man called John, Duke of Montague, who was an extraordinary figure and I suppose ahead of his time, an enlightened figure. He really did believe in black equality in many ways. And so he tried to give him an education. The sisters sort of tried to block him, but eventually he did learn by borrowing books. He grows to be a composer and the musician. He publishes 3 books of his music in his time, sponsored by the Duke of Montague, who, by the way, worked for the royal family. So he was very close. There's a room in Windsor Castle, according to the archives of the Montague family, that was named Sancho's room.
Really?
So he's really part of that circle. And his life was just so fascinating. Eventually, he obviously painted by Gainsborough, etc., but eventually he marries a black wife, Anne Sancho, who he loves, Anne Osborne, who he loves to bits. It's so romantic. Every time he mentions her, calls her my best self, my best half. Yeah. And he calls his kids, and he has 8 of them, my Sanchonetters. It's just something very sort of fatherly about him, a loving, open father. All his kids learnt to read and write, which is very unusual in the time. We have letters from his daughters, his daughter Elizabeth, at the British Library. His son Billy went on to be a printer and a librarian, as in bought libraries for people. Extraordinary life. And then right at the end, when he had a grocery store in Westminster, he voted. 1774 for the first time, in 1780, the year he died. And he then is, I suppose, the first man or person of African descent that we know of to vote in a British parliamentary election in this country. And so, of course, it was a no-brainer to tell his story. But how? Because that's quite a lot of information. But the novel is brilliant because you can just sort of do a kind of David Copperfield or Oliver Twist and tell some details and get into his head a little bit. So that's what I did.
Yeah, wow. Well, honestly, there are so many things I could ask you from that overview. But it's a Q&A for the audience, not for me, unfortunately. And we do have some great questions, but we do have a few comments that are great as well. Victoria commented, sometimes people just get you, their time in history. It can be anyone. We don't have a choice. It's like they come up and tap you on your shoulder and tell us to tell their story. Is that how you felt with
Sancho? Mean, yeah, Victoria, kindred spirits. I think it's possession. I think it's kind of strange possession. You sort of get to a sort of a place where everything you see, you think, how would they look at this? I wonder what their thoughts would have been on this. And then you read something about them and you feel like you're with them and contemplating with them bits of their life. I would wonder what Sancho's life like being 2-3 years old, speaking Spanish, presumably, or some kind of language that was not English, coming to England. What's that like? And I would meditate on that for ages and really get a feel of how that alien environment he was in was doubly alien because of the language, and what did he understand? What was he piecing together? But that's like a possession. It's like you've gone inside somebody's head and looked out of the world in their eyes. And I think about people, wonderful people like Hilary Mantel, who write, I mean, she's probably, I would say, the best of them all, writing a historical fiction. Because Thomas Cromwell was unknown to me. I mean, I knew he was the father of Oliver, but that was about it. I didn't know really who he was, but I feel like I know him. It's just so strange, but she was clearly sort of possessed with him. I think she could smell his world, to see his world, feel his world. Everything about those series of novels is very sensual, in that our senses are alive to what he is seeing and what the world around him would have been like. And I think it's a sort of act of possession in some ways.
Yeah, I think that's a great thing as well about listening through audiobook, because it really does feel like, especially when it's like an epistolary form like Sancho, it really does feel like they are talking to you. The person, like you're in dialogue with them. So yeah, I think audiobook is a great way to learn about these historical figures. We've got a great question here from Paz Barling, who said, "It's a really great audiobook. Did you have in mind how the book would sound when read aloud for audio?"
Yes.
Yeah.
In a nutshell, I always read my work out loud. A tip, not just because I love the sound of my own voice. No, but it was a tip from the amazing, this is a big name drop now. Arthur Miller was 80 years old, and they were doing a celebration at the National Theatre. And thankfully, I was invited as one of the actors to do some performances for him. But we had a Q&A with him, just the actors, which is just an amazing privilege.
Wow, yeah.
And somebody asked him why his dialogue seems so authentic, and he said, "I read everything out loud." And I thought, he was not a performer. He was a very modest man, in many, many ways, very sort of contained. And I thought that's deeply interesting, because I know a lot of writers who are brilliant writers, but if you come to speak their words for an audiobook, for example, which I obviously do every now and then, you realize that they're not speaking. This is not how people would speak. It works on the page, but it doesn't work vocally. And so that's what I do. I sort of took the template of the monodrama that I wrote, and I thought, let me just continue that, but make it private. Hence the diary form, which is, again, the most intimate form of personal writing, of course. It also gives you license for the character to make assumptions about things that are not true. Whereas if you paint a world like a sort of God figure, you've got to know what's happening. Mystery is harder to do in that way, but doing it in that form, speaking those words as if I'm just thinking these thoughts, makes it highly sort of personal, and also has a sort of theatrical effect in that it feels like it's happening live in front of you. That was the sort of effect I wanted. So I'm glad that comes across. And it's meant to be written. It's meant to be heard as well as read, I think, this work.
Yeah, it really does. I was wondering, something that we often talk to authors about is the casting process for their audiobooks and making sure they find the right person. And you obviously didn't have that problem because you voiced the audiobook.
Well, I mean, I joke that you haven't seen Idris Elba around for a while. Well, he was suggesting that he would be reading it, and he had an accident. The idea of anybody else reading it is just anathema to me. I mean, if I get lucky and this novel, long after I'm dead, is still an audiobook, and somebody says, "Oh, well, let's refresh the audiobook," and some other actor reads it, I'm sure it'll be fascinating. But there's nothing like reading your own work, especially if you're an actor, where you can immerse yourself. There is also an interesting dilemma, because the last audiobook I think I read before I went in to read my own was The Three Musketeers for Penguin, which is a massive tome, and it's just an extraordinary book. And I must say I was inspired by it. I'm sure there are hints. In fact, I know that there were hints of Dumas in what I was writing. As soon as I started writing it, I wrote the beginning, felt a bit like him, and then I rewrote it in a different way. But that novel is stunning. It's got about 1 billion characters in it as well, which obviously I can do all the funny voices for. But then I came to read my own, Annabelle, and I was like, why am I reading it like a robot? And I thought, oh, I know what I'm doing. I'm doing what all authors do. Good authors, obviously. They go, well, this is my work. I've written this for you to, sort of read privately, and I'm done. And then here I am now in front of you having to read it, but I don't want to get in your way. so I'm going to read it as blandly as possible. You don't hear anything other than the words. And I think, but now you're in front of us, you've got to perform. So I had about, I think, a few hours sitting in that booth where each time I did a bit, I thought, this feels weird, until I got over it and went, you're not reading, you're not editing, you are just reading it for someone who needs to hear it. So yeah, that was an adjustment, which was odd, and I've never had to do it before, of course.
How did you go about finding the voice for Sancho? He's such a distinctive character. Was it a process trying to find him?
Well, I got lucky in that I have already done a one person show. So I had already had a sort of personality, and I decided I wouldn't reinvent the wheel and try to make the story into something else, that I would use the template of the monodrama, which is about 75 minutes long. And I thought, I will scupper myself if I try and do anything else. I won't get started. So I did that. And that voice comes from, a lot of reading of 18th century texts, particularly people like Samuel Johnson, Boswell, James Boswell, his biographer, and Swift, Gulliver's Travels, Swift. Fielding, and Pope. I would read things that Sancho read. Obviously, he's suffused in Shakespeare as well, so that's with me almost by default, anyway. And then there are anecdotal. There are anecdotes that just make me go, I know who that is. I know how he would sound. Apparently, Sancho, who was always quite overweight, in fact, he called himself Sancho the Fat quite a lot, and Sancho the Big. And he would also say, I am a man of a convexity of belly like Falstaff. He was sort of took on his own thing. So he was quite proud in that he would never be insulted. He would always come back. And here's the wonderful incident that just made me go, oh, I think I know who this is, at least the public face of this person. So he's walking along the road and in London, and they're described as fashionables. Two fashionables are walking by him, and one turns to the other and says, smoke Othello. Have a look at Othello over there. Apparently, Sancho waddles in front of them, stands there, claps his hands on his belly and says, aye, sirs, such Othellos you meet with but once in a century. Such Iagos as you we meet with in every dirty passage. Proceed. And off they trot. And I think, that's that guy. Wow, I know that guy. And so it's really just a matter of sort of reeling it back. So that's a public show. So he has that personality, but how would you modify that to how would he talk normally? So there's a bit of that. Also, Joseph Jekyll, who writes his biography, the only biography we have, in the preface of the letters published a couple of years after Sancho died, says that he had an incorrigible, what did he call it? An incorrigible defection of speech, or words to that effect. And in the show, I always say, look, I've given him a little lisp. Because you don't want to be there. Basically, you don't want to stutter, because that's going to take an hour and a half to get through, a 75-minute play. But you also don't want any other speech impediment that's going to affect the audience, because it just takes people away sometimes, especially as I don't have one naturally, and I didn't want to put on anything on big. So he also, whenever he speaks, when I think of him speaking as himself to somebody, as opposed to his own voice when he's thinking, the two things are very different. So there's that, I thought such Iagos as you, he would have something there, but when he's thinking, I suppose a bit like somebody who stutters, they're not thinking in a stutter, singing in a stutter. So there's that. There's those two bits. So if anybody thought, oh, he's made a mistake, he keeps lisping every now and then, he's struggling, it was actually on purpose. Let's talk about his lisp in it, actually. Just talk about his speech in the novel.
Amy's asked a great question coming on from that Othello and Iago incident. She's asked, the book is full of performances and Shakespeare references. How did your past experience and career to date help shape Sancho into the novel it is?
I mean, completely. There's no way if I was proper historian, then I would have written it like that. I would have taken a step back. I would have probably been a bit more Hilary Mantel about it, and it may have been better for it. And maybe somebody will in the future write a novel like that. I would be perfectly happy to see that. I'm an actor, so I have no choice but to, and a storyteller by disposition, so I have to imbue everything I do with the sense of story, as opposed to here are some facts, here are some truths. This is what happened, then this, which is a fine way to tell a story, but I just can't do that. So that's, I think, explains why I sort of launch into it in such a sort of boldly theatrical, who are these people? How do I see them? Oh, the sisters are like this, and Abigail's like this, and Beatrice is like this. I mean, Beatrice, for example, I always think of Beatrice as struggling. Everything's terrible. And of course, I've got this terrible nasal issue. But so there's a sort of dignity that she thinks she has that makes her just profoundly, irritating. But all of the characters that I, if you like, depict are real people, pretty much, apart from obviously people like the sisters. Jonathan Sill is an invention, but based on true real people, obviously.
Yeah.
Are people who are historical figures, and so I've got a lot of information on them. For example, Samuel Johnson, who had what we probably now diagnose as Tourette's, would have, fling his arms about and strange tics when I think it was Garrick or Hogarth, I think it might have been Hogarth who said yes. It wouldn't have been Garrick, because Garrick knew him from Lichfield. So I think Hogarth said when he met Samuel Johnson, he thought he was, and this is the old terms, an idiot. He thought he was somebody who did not have, he couldn't articulate. He didn't seem to know what he was talking about. And then he would listen to him, he said, and he suddenly realized the man was a genius, but it was all of this stuff around him. So of course I wanted to paint that picture of a man who seemed to have a sort of storm of words and, as I said, clauses and classical illusions just sort of spinning around his world. And that was a joy to paint some of those characters.
Lovely. So Victoria has another question. The name Ignatius, does it come from the Bible? It's not a name you hear very often.
So he was baptized, Charles Ignatius, in Colombia, according to his biographer, Joseph Jekyll, by the Bishop of Cartagena. And he baptized him, Charles Ignatius, after Ignatius Loyola, who was the founder of the Jesuits. And so that's what that's come from. There's fire in there, I think, that means something like fire or flame.
Right.
But there we are. Yeah.
Thank you. We did have a great comment earlier that I've just picked up on from Linda, who said, I'm really interested by the fact that as a child at school, I didn't even know that there were any people of color in our history. I feel as if I only had half an education.
Yeah, boom. That's exactly. I've got this new show that I do, which is called Sancho and Me for One Night Only. I've only sort of performed it 10 times. I have a musician, Ben Park, with me, a composer and a musician, and we play Sancho's music, and I play with my life and his, and we intertwine them. And when I talk about when I first saw this portrait, which might as well have another ping at it, there, I just thought it was incongruous. It felt like Hogarth had done a pastiche and gone, hey, this is what black people would look like if they were free and allowed to be educated, etc. And it was in that outrage, I suppose, that I am born here. In fact, about 3 miles from here, where I am now. Grew up about a mile from here. That I didn't know any of this. And that when I would walk along the streets, there were often signs, things like "Keep Britain White," and I would always feel, of course you did, as if you were not welcome, particularly. And the fact that I didn't know that we had roots, African and African Caribbean roots in this country for millennia. And certainly, if you think about the African emperor Septimius Severus, who came here in 192 AD, for millennia, then I feel like this is a thing that we should be outraged by. I meet historians and I do universities talks who say to me, and these are people who are older people now, who said, I got a first at Cambridge or Oxford, Birmingham or wherever, and I didn't know anything about this history. And so there is an outrage, and we should just, this is our family history. I've always said this from the beginning. This is our history. It's not just Black history, it's our history. It's British history. We're intertwined. And we have to be, given, you know, Britain's involvement, deep involvement in Africa and the African chattel slave trade. That it has to profoundly affect everything about Britain. How we became a superpower in the world comes from slavery. There's no doubt about it. And so I have a profound sort of, I suppose, gratitude to anybody who sees it, who wakes up. I use the word, who wakes up and goes, oh, I didn't know anything about this. It was been shielded from me. Our history has definitely been curated, I'd say that much. And the curation has happened partly by accident and partly by design. I mean, you think about women in history, they're not writing, not allowed to be published, probably. Certainly learning would have been at a minimum. It'd be very hard for them to have made a mark for themselves in order to show what women's life was like. And so we're finding it out now. So our history has been curated mainly by, of course, those who have had time and the resources to write. So they would all have been male, and all have been middle to upper class and above. And so that's a very narrow pool from which we're getting our history from. And if your history is taught by people who aren't, you know, particularly caring about, that particular demographic, whether that's women, whether that's children, whether that's African people, Indian people, Chinese people, Arab people, then they'll be missing. They'll be missing from that archive. It doesn't mean they weren't there. It just means they're missing. And that's the job of the modern historian, I think, is to try to find these little nuggets and bring them to life. There's a wonderful American writer called Saidiya Hartman who has coined a phrase, which is, I suppose, the practice that I've been doing and other people have been doing, and certainly people like Hilary Mantel have been doing long before this phrase was invented. But it's a great phrase: critical fabulation. Always sounds better in American. Critical fabulation. And it's basically looking, not sort of making stuff up, but it's looking at the archive and saying it's threadbare. There's hardly anything here. But if I can look at other people who are like this person and see where they went, why they traveled from that place to this place, what was happening in terms of society, were there wars, were they moved by conflict, were they moved by the need to get work? So you sort of paint a picture of the choices that somebody might make, and by that you can build a greater picture of who that person is. You're getting it from fragments, but yeah, you're back. You're getting it from fragments, but at least in many ways you are creating from real sources as opposed to just your imagination. So critical fabulation and Saidiya Hartman's work is going to profoundly affect, I think, the future historical writers.
Sorry, I missed that. My computer
No, it's okay.
randomly decided to turn off.
People?
We don't have the best technology. We have a very old building.
Oh, don't worry. No, I can keep talking forever, so that was fine.
Okay.
I was a bit worried about you, but I like the fact that you came back and you did this very sort of 1970s detective drama thing when they start the generic titles. You went, "You're back. Annabelle's back in the building."
Yeah, I couldn't believe it. Like, of all times, my laptop just to randomly turn off.
It's all right. It was fine. It was fine.
Yeah. Well, thank you for holding down the fort while I've been gone. But yeah, you'll have to fill me in on what you were talking about.
We were just talking about how history is hidden, and that it's written mainly by people who had the power and the pen, if you like. And they would have been 99.99999% male and middle class or upper class. I mean, the middle classes probably didn't write that much. It would have been more upper classes because people didn't have time. But that's where we are now, actually, at the moment. And most of the writing, although things are changing, have been written by people who have time on their hands because it takes time. Remember, I didn't write this novel until I had lockdown. You know, you can stop for a bit and have the luxury to just ponder and then write and try things. It's quite hard to do when you're trying to make money, and you've got a life to lead. So yeah, it's wonderful that we're getting a more diverse group of writers, more women, more people of color, more people of third gender, more people who are not binary in terms of their sexuality. We're getting stories that are, for me, they're opening up worlds that I know nothing about, and it's my best way, particularly novels, of finding out how people live. Like, I know I see through the eyes of Jane Eyre that world, and the hopes of Mr. Rochester noticing her, and of course he's not going to notice her because she's just this orphan girl, and her struggles with who she is and her low self-esteem. Of course I empathize with that. It's a beautiful piece of work, and that is the way I think I've learnt about the world and learnt about how people think, apart from conversations with people. And this one thing I might say before we leave is that statistically, men don't read novels. And I wonder about that, because sometimes I equate it with empathy, because you have to lose yourself a little bit, lose your judgment a little bit, and judgmentalism as well, and sink into the life of someone when you dig into a novel. And it's a shame that men don't do that, but it also maybe shows that we don't do that enough.
Yeah, no, that's pretty interesting, considering a lot of the novels in the past were written by men,
Exactly,
up until recently.
Yeah.
But we've got a question from Vanessa, who has asked, "Are you working on another book?"
Yes, but it's not a book about Sancho or a novel. It's really, when I talked earlier about these black kids in portraiture, they always make my heart ache every time I see them, because they're real people, and they are just called a Negro child and black child in these portraits, and it just breaks my heart, and it has ever since I discovered them. And there's just hundreds and hundreds, folks, of these portraits. And there's a group of people who are trying to, which I'm sort of a vague outlier kind of actory part of, curators and people who run museums, etc., and galleries, and historians and art historians, to gather the information about these kids and try to figure out who they were, and at least tell us we see them. We know they're very small in the portrait or in the background, but we see this child, and this child could have been. And there are a few who have now been brought out, which is just a beautiful thing, brought out of the portrait, and now we know who they are after 250 years. So I'm going to co-write a book with a wonderful lady called Zaria Ware, who's an American author of a book called Black, BLK, Black Art, a beautiful book about black people in portraiture through the years. And so that's the next thing, and it will have a bit of story in it, and it's for kids, so it'll be from 9 to 12, and it'll be a sort of junior art detectives international, because you can sort of find all sorts of information around the world. So that's what I'll be working on next, probably coming out late next year if the day job allows me to write it.
That sounds great. With you going on to write books for children, I wonder if one of your hopes for this novel, for Sancho, is that maybe it would be taught in schools, in like secondary schools, and for like GCSE A-level curriculums. Is that one of your passions or missions about writing this?
Well, I suppose it would be any writer would want that. Any writer would want that. I think I have an extra sort of edge to it, in that it's also history that is hidden. So it wouldn't just be for the vanity of having my novel read and analysed. It would also be for the fact that this man's been unknown. It seems by many, still quite largely unknown. Actually, I'm doing my best, but doing my best. Yeah, that would be wonderful, because he opens up, as he has done for me, a sort of portal into a world of Britain, my country, that I didn't know anything about, and it's really helped me root myself in this country and feel at home, which is strange, because, as I said, born and bred here, but it took me until I found Sancho, till I went, oh, right, this is fine. It's good to be here, and I'm part of this country's story.
Yeah. Julie's commented, she's asked a great question. Could Sancho be a children's book?
Oh, well, obviously, yes, it could. There have been versions of that. There's a lady called Judy Hepburn who's written a book, a sort of biography, adventure story, I think, of Sancho. There's the wonderful J.T. Williams, whose series, the Lizzie and Bell Mysteries for younger readers, is wonderful. She's on her writing her third moment, and it's Lizzie, as in Elizabeth Betsy Bruce Sancho, Sancho's last child, and Dido Elizabeth Bell, who lived up in Kenwood House, as teenagers who meet to solve mysteries. And it's just brilliant because at the side, sort of sidebar, you get bits of history that are interesting, and it's wonderful. So may there be many, many more of these. And I'd love to see the animated, it's beautifully illustrated, those books, the Lizzie and Bell Mysteries by Simone Douglas, beautiful black and white illustrations. Yeah, I hope that there's just more and more and more of this that comes out, so that I can have a rest. Rest.
Yeah, there is so much material, and in the audiobook, I don't know if our listeners have listened to the audiobook or read the book, but an addition that I really liked about the audiobook is that there's music like interspersed within it, and you only find out at the end that this music actually comes from Sancho's own compositions.
Grand, good, yeah, love it.
Yeah,
I always
that
think
was
about audiobooks. I just think look, you listen to Radio 3 or Radio 4 when they've got a play on, it's brilliant. Or if somebody's reading something and they've got some underscore, wonderful. Why can't there be that in an audiobook? It's wonderful for people who don't want to hear any music, any background music. I get that because it's distracting for some of us. But this is just incidental music in between.
Yeah.
And it just gives it a fuller feel. Plus, now you know that you've been living with him, both musically and sort of verbally. So I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Victoria's commented, taking on the mental of telling someone else's story. They don't let you rest. I know. Are you writing about someone's story, Victoria? That would be really interesting to find out.
Yeah, let's hear Victoria. What are you writing about?
Sam's got a great comment as well. I think you have just given me a new perspective. I've often wondered, why do they teach history and then separately teach a Black History Month? It has seemed stupid to segregate something we have been trying to integrate. However, if the history has ignored part of the population, whitewashing, it is going to be hard for schools to gather the information that isn't easily available and bring to light every person of all backgrounds.
That's very good. I like that. Well done, Sam. That's a really clever and interesting comment because, of course, the end game, and this is the end game, so it's obviously idealistic, is that it's all talked together. That it's our history.
Yeah.
It actually is. But as we know, if it's very male and very Caucasian, then it's going to be skewed. So we do have to have women's history. We do have to have gay history. We do have to have transgender history. We have to have these histories because they're not part of the mainstream. You know, Walter Mosley, who is an African-American writer, Devil in a Blue Dress, I think, is probably his most famous work. He said that when asked, why do you write Black characters? And of course, that's a ridiculous question because you're not asking, Martin Amis why he was writing white characters. Just a ridiculous question. But anyway, he answers it and he says, I write Black characters because that's my world, but also if a people doesn't exist in its country's literature, they might be said to not exist at all. And I found that a very profound comment, that if we're not there in your Oliver Twists and in your David Copperfields and your Jane Eyres, then we were just not there.
Yeah.
Why all this stuff feels new to some. And some people cry out, oh, you're rewriting history. You're tinkering with history. I said, well, history is always being tinkered with.
Yeah.
And yes, we are rewriting it because it was written rather badly. There were bits missing. There's bits missing. So why can't we rewrite it? The best writing, as any writing teacher will tell you, is the rewrite. And when it comes to history, new things are coming up all the time. When things are digitized, suddenly things are found that were missed. When people are looking at an archive, who've looked at an archive in a particular way, and then a new person comes who has a different worldview, they're suddenly seeing something that the previous archivist just didn't see because they weren't looking for it They were looking for something else. And here's this person going, oh my God, oh, there was an Indian suffragette. She was a princess. Oh my gosh. And so Anita Anand writes this wonderful book about Sophia, princess who was also a suffragette. Why was that not written?
Yeah.
150, 100 years ago. Why was that not written? Because whoever was looking at the suffragette archives just didn't see it. So yeah, that's where I suppose that's where the future historians will get work. Humanities are always under attack in universities.
Yeah.
We only need STEM, or we need STEAM, we need art in the middle of all of it. Otherwise, we're just robots building robots. How do you know how to make a thing for people if you don't know what people need?
Yeah.
And we see that with AI at the moment and with coding, that actually it needs a more diverse group of people who are coding. Otherwise, we live in a world made by people who live in their basements. But the idea that we can open the world and make us as human beings a bit more knowledgeable is about each other is a good thing, I think, is a good future thing. Anyway, there you go. I think I might have waffled on enough.
No, you definitely haven't. It's been so interesting. But I am looking at the time, and I do think we'll have to wrap up shortly. But I do have one more question I'd like to ask you before we leave. If anything, what do you think that we can learn from Sancho?
Not to be restricted by our origins. So that a man born on a slave ship who becomes the first man of African descent to vote, and remember, only 2% of the population in the UK were voting. They were all male and they were all white. The fact that this man could raise his hands at the hustings in Covent Garden, they would have been in Covent Garden Square before that clock. There are some great prints actually online with that crowd, is an extraordinary thing. However he managed to do it, whoever tells that story of how he manages to do it, that's a profoundly affecting thing for me. I have to vote. I have to be vocal. If I have an idea or if I see an injustice, I have to step out because my restrictions are much less than his. So I think that he teaches us to not let your origins dictate your entire life.
Definitely. Well, I think that's a brilliant note to end on and something for us all to think about as we go on with the rest of our days. But thank you so much.
You're welcome, Annabelle. I really appreciate you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you for everyone for joining and for all of your great questions.
Folks. Thank you very much. I hope you have a lovely afternoon.
Yeah, and thank you to the Virtual Village Hall as well. They are a fantastic organisation. They run so many different classes for whatever you're interested in, so do check them out. And thanks again, Paterson. You've been wonderful.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll head off now, but just as a reminder before we leave, Listening Books is an audiobook lending charity here in the UK. We offer over 10,000 books, including The Secret Diaries of Charles Ignatius Sancho by Paterson Joseph. Okay, I think we'll have to wrap up there, but thank you again, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.